Hi everybody and welcome to week 2 of my program that I'm doing for the Rogers Public Library. So last week, if you remember, we covered Georgia O'Keeffe and we did this lily pad project. And this week we're going to be covering an artist from China in the 1600s. So this artist was Shen Quan. He was born in China in 1682 and he was really famous for making poetry, music, and also his artwork. He often did a lot of landscapes and he did a lot of paintings of animals. And this is the example we're covering this week. So a way that I thought to do this was to use ink, but then I realized probably most people won't have ink at home. I actually don't think I have any. And so I was thinking about ways that you can paint something like this using just something that you have at the house. And so I actually used coffee to paint. This is what I ended up making. One of the main things that you're going to have to do when you create this is you're going to want to use a lot of layers, and I'll explain this while I'm showing you my process. The only way that you can get these darker colors as you're doing this is to layer them on top of each other. You can't just paint over it or you're going to make a mess of the painting. So here was how I did this. So I used any piece of cardstock, or I actually used watercolor paper, but you can use cardstock or construction paper or anything you might have. You're going to want to use something that's going to hold the paint. And then I actually got a second piece of paper and I actually tested out how the coffee works. So I just took some coffee grains, poured some hot water into it, and actually made some coffee. And I waited for it to cool down. And then I actually, at first, thought that it might have been a little bit too harsh of a color because it's so dark in the cup. So I poured some of it out into a separate container and put some water in it to dilute it a little bit because I thought that might actually help, but it was way too light to use. So I just used the regular coffee and it was still very light. That's why I say that you need a ton of layers in order to actually make anything. So I'm really glad that I tested it on here just so that I can show you this. And then I also tested out this red tea that I made because I thought maybe I could use color. But the interesting thing about the red tea was that it went on red, but it actually dried out green. So after I had tested it, I got my final piece of paper and I started working on it. So I started out by making a small oval and then a bigger one underneath that's sort of angled, and that's going to be the main body of your cat. After I made those general shapes, I went through and I painted the bark of the tree, and I just went with one paintbrush and made a straight line all the way up, and then what I did was I made lines coming out of it. The way that you can make it look like a tree is by, after you add a branch, adding another one angled to the side of it to almost create a Y sort of shape. If you keep doing these on top of each other and maybe do 3 to 4 per branch, that can make it look like it's a tree. And then what I did was I painted some smaller mountains on the bottom. I just added some hills, and then I let this layer dry. Now, a few things you should know: there may be some small little black dots in your painting. That's okay, that's just the coffee grounds. Once it dries, you can flick those off. Another thing you should know: this is going to be a very light layer. It may look extremely light, but it's going to get better. Then I waited about 30 minutes and mine was pretty much dry. Before I let it dry though, I did pat down some parts of it that were a little bit heavy on the water with a napkin to make sure that it doesn't take forever to dry. And then I did a second layer, just adding some more detail to the cat. I painted the legs on, and then I added a little bit of a shadow in the back and added on the facial features. And then I added some more lines to the tree to make the branches of it more detailed. I let that layer dry for about 30 minutes, and then I just went through and did all of the layer that I did before again on top of it to make it even darker. And then I took my red tea and I painted the flowers on the branches and onto the landscape. I felt like these would look good as red, but they actually turned into blue, so keep that in mind if you have red tea that you want to use as well. I think something interesting about this whole painting is that it's made completely out of coffee and tea. There's nothing I used on here that you can't just find in a kitchen somewhere. The only thing that you really need other than those materials is just a paintbrush and a piece of paper. I hope you enjoyed watching this. I hope that you create this, and I'll see you next week with something new.